They did not want ransom. That would have been merciful. What Viking raiders did to captured nuns was designed not for profit, but for psychological warfare, a strategy to shatter the Christian world's sense of divine protection. Women who had pledged themselves to God became living proof that neither prayers nor monastery walls could stop pagan fury, and it worked. Entire kingdoms trembled. The monastery of St. Hilda stood on Northumbria's wind-ravaged coast, perched on cliffs where seabirds nested, and salt spray left everything perpetually damp. On the morning of June 8, 793 AD, Sister Edith knelt in the chapel 17 years old, hands folded in prayer, her breath visible in the cold dawn air. Candlelight flickered across stone walls carved with crosses and Latin verses promising salvation to the faithful. She had taken her vows just 14 months earlier, still remembered her mother's tears, still felt the weight of the woolen habit settling on her shoulders that first day, the abbess's blessing like a shield against the world's cruelties. The screaming started before prime bells could ring. At first, distant villagers, perhaps some accident in the fishing boats below. Then, closer. Rapidly closer. The chapel door exploded inward with such force that iron hinges tore from ancient wood. Men poured through the breach, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing leather and fur that stank of sea voyages and old blood. Their weapons caught the candlelight axes with curved blades, swords with strange patterned metal that seemed to writhe in the flickering glow. Sister Edith tried to run. Her legs would not obey. Around her, other nuns scattered like startled birds, black habits flapping as they fled toward passages that led nowhere safe. The youngest, Sister Oswin, barely 14, made it 3 steps before a raider grabbed her trailing veil and yanked backward. The girl's scream cut through everything else, high and sharp and utterly helpless. What followed would echo across Christendom for generations. A new kind of terror. Deliberate. Calculated. Designed not just to conquer land, but to break faith itself. Viking leaders understood what medieval chroniclers would struggle to articulate, that destroying holy women accomplished what burning villages never could. Every monastery raid followed a pattern, historians later identified in fragmentary records scattered across Scandinavia and Britain. Raiders bypassed fortified towns to strike religious communities first. This was not random pillaging. This was strategic demoralization, targeting Christianity's most visible symbols of purity and divine favor. Nuns represented everything pagan Norse culture found alien celibacy, submission to an invisible god, rejection of earthly power and wealth. To violate them publicly was to demonstrate the Christian god's impotence before Odin and Thor. Medieval letters preserved in Lindisfarne archives describe the Viking calculation in stark terms. They sought not gold alone, but the destruction of faith itself through defilement to those most holy. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. When word spread that St. Hilda's monastery had fallen, panic seized coastal communities from Scotland to Francia. If consecrated women living behind blessed walls could not find safety, what protection could ordinary Christians expect? Viking Jarls exploited this terror systematically. Archaeological excavations at Norse settlements in Dublin, conducted between 1998 and 2003, uncovered holding pens specifically designed for captured religious women separate from ordinary slave quarters, marked with Christian symbols carved mockingly into wooden posts. These were not improvised prisoner spaces. They were purpose-built facilities for a specific type of captive whose value lay not in labor, but in symbolism. Chronicles from the period record that Viking leaders sent messages to Christian kings, surrendered tribute, or watch as more holy women were paraded through pagan settlements wearing slave collars where crosses once hung. The threat worked. Silver poured into Norse coffers from kingdoms desperate to prevent further desecration. But the silver was never enough, because the true goal was not wealth. It was the systematic destruction of Christian morale through sacred violation made public spectacle. Sister Edith learned the truth about helplessness in those first 12 hours. The raiders moved through St. Hilda's with practiced efficiency, kicking over altars, smashing reliquaries to seize the gold inside, herding nuns into the courtyard like livestock. They spoke in a harsh, guttural language that sounded like rocks grinding together. When Sister Margaret, the eldest among them at 62 years old, tried to shield the younger women, a raider struck her across the face with casual brutality. She collapsed without sound, blood streaming from her broken nose. The message was clear: obedience or violence. Those were the only options. Edgy stood among 17 other captured nuns as the sun climbed higher, turning the courtyard stones hot enough to burn through thin sandals. Her throat was raw from screaming that had accomplished nothing. Around her, sisters whispered prayers, desperate, frantic appeals to a god who seemed to have abandoned them entirely. The abbess lay motionless near the chapel entrance, her grey hair matted with blood, her glazed eyes staring at nothing. Raiders sorted them like grain. The elderly and infirm were shoved aside, no value, left to whatever fate awaited. The useless, the young and healthy were pulled forward, hands bound with coarse rope that bit into wrists and drew blood with every movement. Sister Oswin sobbed uncontrollably, her small body shaking so violently she could barely stand. Edith wanted to comfort her, could not reach her, could not save her, could not save anyone. By midday, they were marched toward the beach, where longships waited sleek, predatory vessels with carved dragon heads that seemed to mock the Christian crosses now burning in the monastery behind them. The walk down the cliff path took an eternity. Every step brought them closer to those ships, closer to whatever hell awaited beyond the familiar Northumbrian coast. When Sister Edith stumbled on loose stones, a raider yanked her upright with such force her shoulder screamed. She did not cry out. Some instinct deeper than thought told her that showing weakness would make things worse. Around her, other nuns wept openly, pleaded in Latin and Anglo-Saxon, promised ransoms their families could never pay. The raiders laughed, not cruelly, almost casually, as if the nuns' terror was mildly amusing but ultimately irrelevant. At the water's edge, Edith turned for one final look at the only home she had known since childhood. Black smoke poured from St. Hilda's windows. The chapel bell tower, where she had learned to sing psalms, where she had felt closest to divine grace, was already collapsing, its wooden frame consumed by flames that reached toward heaven like inverted prayers. Then rough hands shoved her into a longship's hull. Darkness swallowed her, and the last thing she heard before oars hit water was Sister Oswin screaming for her mother in a voice that would haunt Edith's nightmares for the rest of her life. The crossing to Norse territories took 11 days across waters so rough that half the captives spent the journey vomiting seawater and bile. The longship's hull was narrow, cramped, designed for speed rather than human comfort. 17 nuns were packed into a space meant for cargo pressed shoulder to shoulder, forced to sleep sitting upright because there was no room to lie down. The stench became unbearable by the third day. Unwashed bodies, waste that sloshed in the bilge below, fish rot, and the metallic tang of menstrual blood from women whose bodies refused to stop their cycles even in captivity. Sister Edith learned to breathe shallowly through her mouth, learned to ignore the hunger that made her stomach cramp and twist, learned that crying accomplished nothing except making raiders laugh, and mock pray in broken Latin, mimicking the women's desperation with theatrical cruelty. At night, when storms battered the ship and waves crashed over the gunwales, she almost hoped they would capsize. Drowning seemed merciful compared to whatever awaited at journey's end. But the ship never sank. Viking seamanship was too skilled, their vessels too perfectly designed for these brutal northern waters. On the 7th day, Sister Margaret, the old woman who had tried to protect them, simply stopped breathing. Her body went slack against Edith's shoulder, growing cold despite the press of living flesh around her. The raiders did not remove the corpse immediately. For hours the nuns sat with death among them, until finally a raider grabbed Margaret's ankle and dragged her up to the deck. They heard the splash. Nothing more. No burial, no prayers, just disposal, as if she had never been human at all. By the time the Norse coast appeared on the horizon, dark cliffs and pine forests so different from Northumbria's gentler landscape, Edith barely remembered what hope felt like. Around her, the other nuns had fallen into numb silence. Even Sister Oswin had stopped crying, her young face hollow and aged beyond its 14 years. When the longship finally scraped against a wooden dock, raiders hauled the women out, like cargo, no gentleness. No care for bruised limbs or rope-burn wrists. Edith's legs nearly collapsed beneath her after 11 days of immobility. The ground felt strange, too solid, swaying despite being motionless. She looked up at the settlement before them, wooden longhouses with sod roofs, smoke rising from central hearths, children running between buildings, normal life continuing as if the world had not just ended for 17 Christian women. And there, near the largest longhouse, she saw them, iron collars, dozens of them, hanging from posts like trophies, waiting for new necks to claim. What happened next was not random cruelty. It was systematic degradation designed to destroy identity itself. The captured nuns were brought before the settlement's jarleman named Ragnar, whose scarred face and grey-streaked beard spoke of decades surviving what most men could not. He sat in a carved wooden chair, drinking from a horn cup, studying the women with the detached interest of someone evaluating livestock at market. Through a translator, a captured monk who had learned Norse during his own years of slavery, Ragnar explained the rules. Their old names were gone. Their vows to Christ meant nothing here. They would work, obey, and serve. Resistance brought punishment. Escape attempts brought death, but not quick death. Educational death, the kind that made examples. Then came the collars. Iron, cold, heavy enough to make necks ache within hours. Each collar was fitted by a smith who worked methodically, hammering rivets into place while the wearer stood trembling, feeling the metal close around their throat like a physical manifestation of captivity. Sister Edith felt hers lock shut with a final decisive clang. The weight settled onto her collarbones, cutting into skin already raw from rope burns. They were stripped of their habits, the black wool that had marked them as brides of Christ torn away and burned in a ceremonial fire while the settlement watched. Naked, shivering in the cold northern air, they were given rough slave tunics, undyed wool that scratched skin, too thin for the climate, designed to remind them constantly of their new status. But that was not the worst part. What followed was the deliberate public humiliation designed to break their spirits completely. They were paraded through the settlement while Norse families jeered and children threw mud and rotted vegetables. They were forced to kneel before pagan altars and recite prayers to Odin in broken Norse. When they refused, punishment came swiftly, beatings with wooden rods that left backs purple and bleeding. Sister Oswin broke first. Just 5 days after arrival, she recited the pagan prayer without resistance, tears streaming down her face, her voice barely audible. The watching crowd cheered. The Jarl nodded approval, and something in the other nuns' eyes changed, a flicker of understanding that their faith, their identity, everything they had built their lives upon, could be stripped away piece by piece until nothing recognizable remained. Edith watched it happen, watched young Oswin transform from a girl who had once sung hymns with pure devotion into a hollow-eyed creature who flinched at loud sounds and spoke only when commanded. The transformation took just weeks, and Edith realized with creeping horror that the same process was happening to all of them. Their captors were not trying to kill them. They were trying to erase them, to prove that Christian faith was as fragile as the women who carried it, that when enough pressure was applied, even the most devout would break. And they were succeeding. Records preserved in Icelandic sagas describe the slave system that awaited captured Christian religious women, a hierarchy of degradation calibrated to maximize psychological destruction. Former nuns occupied the lowest tier of Norse slave society, while male thralls worked fields and female slaves performed household labor. These women faced additional humiliations designed specifically to mock their former sacred status. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites near modern-day Bergen reveals separate quarters where religious captives were housed marked with inverted crosses carved into door frames, a deliberate desecration visible to everyone who passed. Sister Edith was assigned to the Jarl's household. Her days began before dawn, hauling water from the well, scrubbing floors on hands and knees until skins split and bled, preparing food she was forbidden to eat, serving meals to warriors who casually discussed their next raids on Christian lands, while she stood silently behind them. The iron collar never came off. After the first month, her neck developed permanent sores where the metal rubbed skin raw. She was given a new name, Tova, a common Norse slave designation. When anyone called her Sister Edith, punishment followed: starvation for a day, or public beating in the settlement square, where villagers gathered to watch justice performed on those who forgot their place. But the physical suffering was manageable. The body adapted, found ways to endure. The spiritual destruction cut far deeper. Every Sunday the day that had once meant mass, communion, collective prayer. The Christian slaves were forced to work the hardest, most degrading tasks: cleaning animal pens, hauling night soil, tasks deliberately chosen to defile them on the day they once considered holy. When Sister Edith tried to whisper prayers while working, a Norse woman overhead reported her. The punishment was swift: forced to stand in the settlement center for 12 hours, holding a wooden idol of Thor above her head. When her arms finally gave out and she dropped it, the beating that followed left her unable to walk for 3 days. The message was clear: their God could not protect them. Their faith was worthless. Their former lives were erased. And slowly, horribly, Edith felt pieces of herself disappearing. She stopped praying aloud, then stopped praying silently, then stopped believing anyone was listening at all. The transformation happened so gradually she barely noticed, until one morning she woke and realized she could not remember the words to the Pater Noster, the prayer she had recited since childhood, the foundation of her entire spiritual life. It was simply gone, erased by exhaustion and despair and the relentless daily grind of survival. Around her, the other captured nuns underwent similar erosions. Sister Oswin stopped responding to her Christian name entirely, answered only to the slave name her captors had given her. 2 older nuns died that first winter, not from violence, but from something deeper: a surrender to hopelessness that shut their bodies down as completely as if their hearts had simply forgotten how to beat. By spring, only 9 of the original 17 remained. And of those 9, Edith was no longer certain how many still remembered who they had been before the longships came. The Vikings had succeeded. They had not killed these women's bodies. They had killed their souls, proven that Christian faith was as mortal and fragile as the flesh that carried it. And word of this destruction spread. Letters between monasteries, carried by terrified monks, warned of the fate awaiting captured religious women. Coastal communities began abandoning monasteries entirely, fleeing inland where Viking ships could not reach. The psychological warfare was working exactly as designed. One settlement's worth of broken nuns had paralyzed Christian defenses across entire kingdoms. They had taken everything that could be taken: names, vows, bodies, even belief. Yet something remained. In the slave quarters, long after the settlement slept, Sister Edith, now called Tova, whispered her real name into the dark. Not loudly, not proudly, just enough to hear it exist. Others followed, one by one, names spoken like contraband, like weapons. I am Eert. I am Hild. I am Hild. I am Squenberg. Remembering became rebellion. They carved tiny crosses where no one looked, hummed hymns without words, taught new captives how to endure winters, hunger, humiliation, how to survive without disappearing. It was not open resistance. It was quieter, more dangerous. The Vikings tried to erase them. Some broke, others bent, and bending without surrender became its own form of victory. Of the 17 nuns taken from St. Hilda's, only 4 are believed to have survived more than 5 years. One record found centuries later mentions a Christian slave woman who died still wearing an iron collar, decades after her capture. No name, just a line in a ledger. Whether that was Edith, no one can say. But the damage spread far beyond individual lives. Viking raids intensified because the strategy worked, monasteries emptied, families stopped sending daughters into religious life. Entire regions reshaped themselves around fear. The terror wasn't the raids alone, it was what happened after. Holy women turned into warnings, and Europe listened. These women left no diaries, no graves with names, no monuments. Most were erased exactly as intended, but fragments remain. Scratches in stone. Buried crosses. Whispers in sagas of Christian slave women who refused to forget who they were, even when forgetting would have been easier. Sister Edith survived decades of slavery, not victorious, not free, but unbroken enough to remember her name. That matters. Because memory is the only justice left. They were meant to vanish into silence. If their story reached you, then they did not. They remembered themselves in the dark. Now we remember them